Hello, I'm Joey from EDHREC, and if you've seen me at any events recently, you may have seen that I'm carrying around this little fella. And that's because this year I've embarked on a very fun project. I'm logging every game that I play, and at the end of the year, I'm excited to make a full episode going into detail about the results. I just think it's fascinating, like which decks did I play the most? Which decks did I play the least? Which decks won the most? What's my overall win percentage? What's the average length of the games that I'm playing? Are there any decks that are more powerful than I thought they were and therefore I need to scale them back? That sort of thing. And my podcast co-host, Dana Roach, is logging all of his games too. I'm excited to talk about the results with him at the end of the year. I think it'll be a fun episode. Now, obviously, we're not even halfway through the year, but between game nights with friends and family, our weekly EDH stream, and also a bunch of games that I've played at events and conventions, I've played 80 games of Commander this year. So I just wanted to do a quick check-in. I wanted to share any trends I've noticed so far, what the overall experience has been like, and any lessons that I learned throughout this whole process. This is not definitive, not at all, it's just a check-in. But if you're intrigued by the project, then maybe these lessons could be useful to help you if you're tracking your games too. So let's take a look. First, here's an example of how a game looks once I log it into my spreadsheet. On the left, underlined, is the commander I played that game. So in this case, my boy Wilhelt the Rodcleaver. Then we have the commanders my opponents played. I italicized the player who went first. For this one, my mom's Dragonlord Ojutai deck. And then the winner is in bold. Our friend Tamiya took it home with her Kyler Sigardian Emissary deck. Below that, I mark the turn the game ended, as well as a brief description of how they won. In this case, a surprise call the Coppercoats on the end step to create like a billion human tokens that Kyler then turned into 10/10s to attack for lethal out of nowhere. Another small detail I track is in gold, and that's the presence of fast mana. If someone starts turn 1 with a Soul Ring or a Mana Crypt or a Jeweled Lotus, I mark that down too. It doesn't come up very often, but they are noteworthy moments, so I wanted to track them to see whether they affect the data. More on that in a sec. Once the game is logged, I mark whether or not I've won, as well as the turn the game ended on. And that gets averaged out into this. Thus far, my average game length has been about 9.5 turns. So far, the shortest game I've played this year was 5 turns, and the longest game I played was 20 turns. In addition, my little program here tallies up my ones and zeros to see how many games I've played total and how many of them I've won to get my overall win percentage. I've won 24 of the 80 games I've played this year, and that puts me at exactly a 30% win percentage. In a 4-player game, we'd expect to win about 25% of the time, so that's higher than the expected average. But I don't want it to get too much higher, you know? Like, I don't want to play decks that are punching too hard. And actually, this figure has transformed wildly over time. At the start of the year, it was at like 12% or something, so it definitely fluctuates a lot, and I'm interested to see how it all shakes out by the end of the year. Now, because I'm a crazy person, I've also done this, a breakdown of the individual decks themselves. I don't just want a zoomed out bird's eye view, I want the nitty gritty. How many times have I played each deck, and how often has that deck won? What's the average game length of each individual deck? This is the real meat of it all. Right off the bat, you can see that the number of times I've played each deck is very imbalanced. I've played Babala Saga and my Commander deck 17 and 14 times respectively, and the rest are in much lower numbers. This is most often because of events and conventions. Babala Saga is my signature deck. I love to play it, and a lot of folks are excited to play against it. And the Commander deck with Tymna and Tana is a definite fan favorite. Like, often when I sit down for a game and the whole table starts talking about the different options that they have to play, as soon as I start to describe this is a deck where every card has to say the word Commander on it, everyone's like, oh man, we gotta see that. And that's awesome. I love both of those decks so much, but I can't deny it has definitely caused my numbers to get pretty skewed. This part of the spreadsheet is where we have to make sure we're being extra careful about any lessons we take away. This is a graph of 80 games. That's not a huge sample size. Some of these decks I've only played one time, like Titania, 1 game, 1 win. That's a 100% win percentage, right? I could retire her as an undefeated champion, yeah? No, for all I know, I could play her 20 more times this year and lose every single one of those games. Or, so far, I've played 4 games with Sir Conrad, and I haven't won any of those games with him this year. But that doesn't mean the deck is bad. 4 games is a teensy sliver of data. Even playing 2 more games with this deck could wildly swing data in another direction. And the same goes for the average game length on the far right column there. All it takes is one more 20-turn game to really throw off any one of these averages. These numbers are something interesting to muse on, but making any definitive claims about them would be irresponsible. I personally just take those numbers there as a sign that it appears I'm playing Conrad against the right type of opponents. Conrad is the type of deck that I only want to pull out against a table who knows what they're signing up for. Or, as another example, there's Vohar's number. I've won 3 of the 5 games I've played with that deck, which was a surprise to me. And Vohar's average game length is slightly smaller than my overall average game length of 9.5 turns. Maybe that's a sign that this deck is better than I thought it was. I mean, to be honest, I was kind of getting that impression just by playing the deck in the first place, but actually seeing that laid out in front of me, it just gives me another small push to make sure that I am mindful about which decks I play in which contexts. But again, none of this data is set in stone. These are still unstable figures. The only certain thing here is that more data is needed. Now, with that said, there are a few personal takeaways that I can leave you with. First, tracking game length is a very hard habit to establish. My current method for this is to put a die on top of or near my library, but adding that extra upkeep trigger in every single game that I play has not been an easy thing to master. And I still encounter moments where I've forgotten to update the number and I'm like, oh shoot, what is it? And I have to pause and count all the stuff and it slows stuff down and it's kind of awkward. And not only that, but putting a dice on top of my library is a trick that I use for other upkeep triggers too. So then I wind up with 3 dice on top of my deck. Tracking game length is not second nature, okay? That's all I'm saying. Plus, for all I know, I've messed up on tracking some of my numbers. We have to admit that there's room for human error here. Second, there's a difference between when a game ends and when a player gets KO'd. We've all been in those games, right? A player or 2 gets knocked out super early in the game, but then the last remaining 2 players standing still duke it out for 6 or 7 more turns. Unfortunately, that's not a thing that I'm tracking. I didn't think about it until months into the project that potentially first player out would be an important metric to take note of. I have that missing from my data set here. And I think it's an important thing to remember, or at least to keep in mind, especially during pre-game conversations. If I have a deck that I can actually say, look, on average, it plays games that are about 10 turns, but the play pattern of that deck is to knock someone out, usually on turn 5, well, it would be pretty dishonest if I just characterized it as a average 10-turn deck and omitted that other detail. There are things here that the numbers are not always going to show us. Third, be aware of a potential observer effect. The knowledge that you haven't won a game all year with your Conrad deck could subconsciously minorly affect how and when you play that Conrad deck. I'm not here to win all my games, I'm here to vibe, I'm here to enjoy people's company. A thing that you'll pretty frequently hear me say if you ever meet me at an event is that I'm not going to remember who wins, I'm going to remember whether we had a good time. But as soon as I started to actually measure out all of this stuff and I started to see all those zeros on the screen for months, well, I gotta admit, it did kind of start to nag at me. And that's something I have to make sure that I am aware of. Once you start to measure a thing, even if it's a thing that you say you don't really care about, being observant of that thing does shift your emotional attachment to that thing. And I have to make sure that I'm careful not to let that motivate me into any brash action. Now, if we get to the end of the year and I've played 15 more games with that deck and I still haven't won any of those, that's when I could start to be like, okay, let's take a closer look at what's going on here. But in the meantime, I have to learn to be more comfortable with a bunch of zeros on a spreadsheet and not use any of these early numbers as a sign of anything drastic. And fourth, there's actually one more thing that I'm tracking. But I don't want to show it to you unless you promise to remember that this is a small sample size, okay? Small sample size. This is not definitive. View responsibly. Another thing I've been able to track is this. How often did the first player win? And how often did a player win the game when they had fast mana on turn 1, such as a Soul Ring or a Mana Crypt, etc.? So for the record, my process of bolding and italicizing made it easy for me to track how often player 1 wins, but I didn't think to track how often the player who goes last loses. I was just curious about a potential first player advantage, but I didn't think about measuring a last player disadvantage. So far though, that figure isn't necessarily anything impressive. No, the more eye-catching figure is the one about fast mana. I've seen a turn 1 Soul Ring Lotus or Mana Crypt in 13 games this year, and in 6 of those games, that player won. So instead of the expected 25% win percentage number, we have 46%, almost half. Once again, this is not a definitive figure. I swear, if I catch y'all saying, well, according to Joey from EDA Trek, fast mana wins almost 50% of the time, I will become Liam Neeson and I will find you. I have a very particular set of skills. Just don't get it twisted, alright? This is a small sample size from one player amidst a vast ecosystem of EDH games. The number of variables in a social, multiplayer game is astronomical. Fast mana could cause one person to draw a lot of attention to themselves and then everyone works together to take them down, and fast mana could be the thing that catapults someone so far ahead that they take over the entire game. All I'm sharing is just some numbers that I've had in my experience. But my experience is not the experience. And also, my experience ain't even complete yet. It's only May. These numbers do not prove anything. And not only that, they also don't disprove anything. Like, I'm not going to get into probability values or else we'll be here all day, but suffice it to say that I don't think 13 games where fast mana was present on turn 1 is enough for us to reject a null hypothesis. Also, I'm sure folks are curious, but at this time, I'm not releasing the full spreadsheet. It just feels like I should say that. I know, I'm a tease, I'm the worst, but the project isn't over yet. You'll have to stay tuned for the entire experience at the end of the year. And that's actually where I'm gonna leave you, because the project isn't complete yet, but it has been an absolute blast. Even if it's also sometimes a bit of a pain in the neck to track everything. I hope it's intriguing to you. I'm happy to answer any questions that you've got about this process, and I'm curious to hear if you've ever embarked upon a project like this and anything you learned while doing it, or any other variables that you think are noteworthy within the data as well. So, bye for now, and remember, EDH wreck your deck before you wreck your deck.